Let's get more on this now from the Roundtable, joined by George Will, Peggy Noonan of the Wall Street Journal, former counselor to the Obama Treasury Department, Steve Rattner, and Katrina Heuvel, editor and publisher of The Nation. So, George, you saw me go back and forth with Mr. Liu right there. He says the president's not going to negotiate over the debt limit, but it is going to get worked out. I guess the White House seems to be betting that the Republicans are just going to cave.
I think the Republicans know this is a weak lever with which to try and move the world because, indeed, the debt ceiling always at the end gets raised. What interested me about what he said was he's looking back and saying the reason the recovery is as bad as it is, and it is bad, is what happened in the summer of 2011 over the debt ceiling. Now, that's a pretty...
It did hurt confidence, though, didn't it?
Well, let's look at the recovery, George. We're now in the fifth year of a recovery. There are 2.2 million fewer jobs than there were in the pre-recession peak. That's 4.5 years in now. And after the recession of 1981-82, we were back at the pre-recession peak in 12 months. 31% of young Americans, 18 to 35, are living with their parents. That ought to scare parents.
And Katrina, that's one of the reasons that the president gave this speech this week. He says he wants to break this, what he's called a destructive, damaging framework, focus on deficits in Washington, wants to get back to investments that he believes will create jobs.
And this is where I wish he had been for a while. It's important he's gone out to the American people. He's exposed the Republican Party for the wrecking crew it is. If it hadn't had sabotage as its only economic plan in these last years, we would have seen the common sense policies the president is now advocating for: investment in infrastructure, in health care, in education. This is what we need to break the terrible inequality that is not simply a moral problem, but a bad economic political problem. So I think we're on a better course, but it's going to require the support of people outside. And I think you see in the Democratic Party a new level of commitment as social issues unify them. But Elizabeth Warren, Sherrod Brown, others have a broader, more populist, smart voice in these conversations.
You are seeing more populist Democrats. I agree with that. But Peggy Noonan, the president going back to the country one more time. It's unclear that these speeches are doing much to move public opinion, much less Washington.
Yeah, I think that's true. When the White House calls it a pivot, somebody counted up and said it's probably the 10th pivot to the economy the president has done since he came in. I noticed that in one of the speeches it went over an hour. There was a heck of a lot jammed in. That told me something. It said, we're not sure exactly what to say, so we're going to say everything, but a speech about everything is a speech about nothing. Beyond that, I think every president in the intense media environment we have now, certainly every two-term president, gets to a point where the American people stop listening, stop leaning forward hungrily for information. I think this president got there earlier than most presidents, and I think he's in that time now.
In a more fractured media environment as well. But Steve Rattner, the question is, if speeches aren't going to do the job and Congress seems to be immovable, is there anything the president can do on his own?
Well, he said he was going to use whatever executive authority he can muster, and there are various levers and programs. You heard Jack Lew mention that in the context of Detroit. There are little bits and pieces that they can do on their own, but we have a government.
What I heard him say in Detroit is that he's not going to follow your advice that you wrote in the New York Times and provide some federal assistance.
We'll get to that, I hope, because I have a different view on some of that anyway. But the point is, we have a system of government that requires consent from the congressional branch as well as from the executive branch, and there's a limit on what he can do. I think he's doing the right thing to go out and call out this need to do something on the economy. I find it extraordinary that we're living in a world of 7.6% unemployment. I'll agree with George that the recovery is certainly slower than anybody would want, and yet Congress is doing nothing. The last Congress passed 30% fewer bills than any other Congress in modern history. This Congress has passed fewer still. You may say it's great, let them pass even fewer laws, but I think some of us think there's work to be done out there, and Congress ought to be doing it.
They're passing fewer laws, but comparable to previous Congresses in legislative pages. They just jump them all into comprehensive legislation. As far as I can tell, your argument is, Katrina, Republicans are at fault because of the 753,000 jobs we've created this year. 557,000 have been part-time. But it's not the Republicans' fault, surely, that workforce participation has declined during this recovery?
First of all, we've accepted in this country a level of joblessness that should not be the new normal. But if you had had a Republican Party that was willing to do common sense things that Republican parties of previous years, I think of Eisenhower, had done in investing in infrastructure, for example, you would have seen the ability to see growth. And that has not happened. And You had a speaker, John Boehner, who said last week that his job is to repeal, not to pass legislation. That is not a constructive Congress at a time when I would agree with you, this recovery is fragile. And I think that is the function of a country and a party, both parties, which have said that austerity, deficit reduction is more important than addressing joblessness. That has been the problem in these last few years.
One of the questions
that is the real crisis,
is going to be,
joblessness.
Peggy, though, whether the pressure created by the sequester, which has been real cuts in several programs, causes at least some Republicans to join Democrats to try to undo it.
Maybe that will happen. I haven't heard about any negotiations or talks or serious signaling that is going on, which is something that always confuses me a little bit about this administration. Katrina, I think part of the problem here is that the president at some point decided these Republicans can't be dealt with. They're recalcitrant. It just can't work. And my feeling has always been no president can ever say that. You gotta try to make it work. Excuse me, Tip O'Neill disliked the president he worked with. They made it work. It always seems to me there's a lack of sway in this White House.
The president's going up to the Hill this week to meet with congressional leaders. You can say what you want about that, but here's the point. What the House Republicans want is not just sequester. The appropriations bills they're passing are far deeper cuts than sequester. They're massive cuts. You look at the transportation bill. They want to cut $5 billion out of it. The Senate wants to add $5 billion. So the point is that the House is not just saying sequester. Sequester itself is a terrible thing, of course, because we're cutting all the wrong things. We're cutting infrastructure. We're cutting R&D. We're cutting exactly the stuff we should be investing in. But I think the president has gone to the Hill. I think he's had them to the White House. He's now out on the campaign, in the field, and he's trying to make his case.
You're looking at a Republican Party that may well now cripple the credit markets and shut down government in order to ensure that 30 million Americans do not have health care. I mean, this is the president, and I speak from the progressive, independent Democratic side of the aisle. People have been frustrated that until now the president has been unwilling to call out the Republicans. There was a lot of playing footsie in 2011. Where did that get him? I don't know where it heads because this Republican Party is not interested in legitimate, fair, common sense compromise.
Toward the end of the Knox College speech that threatened never to end, the president gave us an idea of his idea of reaching out to Republicans. He said, you know, there are a lot of Republicans who really agree with me. They tell me so in private, trust me. But he said, they're afraid of their constituents, so they won't do this. In other words, there are a few intelligent Republicans who recognize the brilliance of my policies, but they're moral cowards. Now, that's his approach to the Republicans?
I love cross-partisan alliances, George. We've agreed on various things over time. I think the most exciting thing in that Congress last week was Justin Amash and John Conyers coming together to say enough to NSA surveillance without accountability and scrutiny.
It did not pass, however. We have to take a break. I want to go quickly back to you, Steve, on this question of the Detroit bailout. You, of course, managed the auto bailout for President Obama. Wrote a piece in the New York Times last week saying he should consider federal assistance. Jack Lew seemed pretty definitive right there. It's not coming.
Well, first of all, there's a difference between a bailout and somehow rescuing the creditors, avoiding the whole bankruptcy process, and some kind of help. And what I'm thinking about is in the second category. I recognize Washington's not going to come in and undo this default and pay off all these bondholders. But you've got a situation where 80% of the pain from this restructuring is being borne by the workers and the retirees if this plan goes through. You have a situation where I've read that whole plan and I don't believe it can solve Detroit's problems. Detroit needs investment, and that's where the federal government and the state particularly can and should help.
Can't solve the problems because their problems are cultural. You have a city, 139 square miles. You can graze cattle in vast portions of it. Dangerous herds of feral dogs roam in there. You have 3% of fourth graders reading at the national math standards. 47% of Detroit residents are functionally illiterate. 79% of Detroit children are born to unmarried mothers. They don't have a fiscal problem, Steve. They have a cultural collapse.
I find that really insulting to the people of Detroit. I think there is a serious discussion to be had in this country about the future of cities in a time of deindustrialization. But in many ways, Detroit has been a victim of market forces, and I think that what Steve said is so critical, that retirees and workers should not bear this, and this story should not be hijacked as one of about greedy fiscal public unions and fiscal irresponsibility.
What Steve said in his op-ed was the people of Detroit are no more to blame than the victims of Hurricane Sandy, because apart from voting, you said, well, what did they vote for? For 60 years, they voted for incompetence, malcontents, And in
Okay,
some cases, criminals.
Get the last word.
So that's fine. And so what do you want to do? Do you want to leave them sitting in exactly the situation you just described? Or in the spirit of America, trying to help people who are less fortunate, whether they're victims of natural disasters or their own ignorance or whatever, do you want to reach out and try to help them and try to reinvent Detroit for not a lot of money? We're talking about a couple $2 billion here. This is small potatoes in the great scheme of life. Or else you have your scenario. Just leave them all sit with feral dogs for the rest of their lives.
Hobbesian anarchy.
It's going to have to be, we do have to take a break.